Resume recording. Okay, we're recording now. So welcome everybody. My name is Pam Lach. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Digital Humanities Librarian here at San Diego State University. And I'm really pleased for y'all to join us today for the first of our 5-part podcasting workshop series that starts today and will resume every other Friday through November at the same time. Before we begin, I want to start with the San Diego State University land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy, we promote this balance and harmony, and we find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. So welcome everybody. I'm super excited to have you here virtually in our virtual Digital Humanities Center, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a moment. As I said, this is a 5-part workshop series, and I have to stop sharing for just a minute because I forgot to put some links in. And you can get all of the resources for today at this link here, and I'll put that link in multiple points throughout the day. Throughout the session. Oops, wrong screen. I think my blood sugar is, there we go. Okay, so what we're gonna do today is start a conversation about podcasting. And for some of you, this might be an introduction to podcasting. And for others, you might have already engaged in some podcasting, whether through the Digital Humanities Center in one of our summer institutes, or through coursework that you might have done either here at San Diego State or elsewhere. And some others of you might just be interested in exploring, whether for personal, at a personal interest, or because you want to launch your own podcast. So today we'll do a broad introduction. We'll talk generally about what it means to engage in podcasting and how we can make sort of good podcasts. And then in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the mechanics of recording. And then we'll move on to editing using 2 different editing software tools. And then the 5th session in November, we'll bring everything sort of back together and talk about strategies for planning a podcast, for staying on track, for organizing your content. And you can register for each workshop at this link here. And I'll put that in chat in a few minutes. And then all of the resources for the podcasting workshop series are here. This Google Drive, this link for the resources, contains all the slides. It contains sample audio if you want to practice, some project management templates, which we'll be looking at in November. This is where I'll put the recordings that I make of each workshop session so that you can refer back to it. If you haven't yet done so, please go ahead and introduce yourself in chat. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, and all that good stuff. One other thing about the resource folder, there's also a document in there for those of you who are instructors and thinking about assigning podcasts. There are some sample assignments and assessment rubrics in a Google Doc there. So if you're curious about how other folks are teaching with podcasting, you can explore that so that you can create your own assignment and assess your own student learning outcomes. Okay, so let's dive in. Throughout this session, today's session is going to be sort of largely conversational. And so at any point, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your virtual hand, or if I don't see you, you can throw something in chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Everyone should have that ability. What we're going to be doing today, first I'm going to just tell you a little bit about our Digital Humanities Center, but then we're really going to focus on what is a podcast and how do we make a good podcast? How do we avoid making a bad one? We'll talk about some best practices, particularly focused around copyright and accessibility, and I'll share some tools and resources. And again, if you don't want to be sort of seen in the recording, please go ahead and turn off your video, and you can also change the way your name is displayed if you're concerned about that as well. So the Digital Humanities Center, Unfortunately, we can't be together in the space to learn how to podcast together. Some of you have gotten to experience that through our summer institutes, but our Digital Humanities Center, which is in SDSU Library, is the hub and home of our DH at SDSU Campus Initiative, which is a cross-disciplinary initiative of faculty, staff, and students who are interested in exploring digital technologies and in addressing and critiquing the uneven and often harmful impact of digital technologies on different communities. We've designed our DH Center to be a place to support that, to explore, to experiment, and to critique. And we're a flexible space that really de-emphasizes technology in favor of human connection. If we weren't in a pandemic and we were on campus together, I would point out we have 2 podcasting studios that in normal times are bookable, so that if you were wanting to record your podcast, you could do that in our space. You would just have to bring your own laptop or check one out at our circulation desk. And this is available for all members of the SDSU community. With the widespread campus closures, the DH Center is closed right now, as are our podcasting studios. But one of the things that this workshop series is really going to focus on is the sort of DIY ethos of like, make the best of what you got. And you can do this without the fancy stuff. Okay, so let's get started. So to begin with, I'm going to ask a question. How often do you listen to podcasts? And I'm going to launch a poll, so go ahead and pick the choice that fits you best. Okay. So just about everybody's voted at this point, or put in their choice at this point. So about 26% of those in our virtual room together listen to a podcast every day. And about the same amount don't listen to podcasts at all. And with sort of the typical, what you'd expect to see. Sorry, I should have shared that. What you'd expect to see in the middle. So really, we're coming at this from a broad range of experiences, which is fabulous. So with that being said, and because not everyone in the room listens to podcasts, I want to start with a basic question. What is a podcast? Does anyone want to offer what, their understanding of a podcast, either in chat or by unmuting? Or if folks are too shy, I can get us started in that.
It's a kind of a publication, isn't it?
Yes, for sure. And I see Tanya says an audio composition. So so we might combine those 2 responses, an audio publication of some sort or another. Anyone else want to contribute, or a radio show as someone else suggested? Anyone else want to contribute a possible definition?
It's kind of like the audio version of a YouTube video, except there's no video.
Very good. So it could be the audio version of what we think of as a typical kind of YouTube video. Now, if you were to look at Wikipedia, it's literally defined as an episodic series of digital audio or video files, which a user downloads in order to listen to. And it seems kind of counterintuitive to say that it can include video, but increasingly, I am seeing podcasts that do actually include a video component, and there are increasingly tools that allow you to do that. The word podcast can refer both to an individual component of a series, or an episode, we might think of it, or as a standalone media file. So we use the words interchangeably to refer to an individual, a subset of well, it can include the entire series, a subset of the series, or the actual file itself. And one of the big distinctions between podcast and radio is that it's not aired in real time. So if I turn on NPR, and I'm an avid listener of NPR, I'm hearing things, they might be broadcast live, but they're, or close to live, depending on what time zone you're in. Podcasts typically are not aired that way, although we do hear the airing of podcasts on stations like NPR, particularly things like Snap Judgment or Freakonomics or other things like that. So I think in many cases that gets blurred where you can listen to some podcasts on the radio. But as compared to the radio, the typical way to experience a podcast is either to go to a website and listen in the browser, or download it from the browser, or subscribe through some sort of RSS feeder. That could be iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or another kind of podcast application that you typically access through your phone. And so in contrast to if NPR, say, is going to broadcast a podcast, we can't choose what episode we're listening to. Whereas if we were to go to, say, the This American Life website, I could go back and listen to past shows. So that's one of those distinctions. That then sometimes we also take radio programs and then can access them through podcast feeders. And really there's a broad range. And I see some of you are sharing some of your podcasts in chat, which is awesome. You'll see really polished and professional ones to, what we might think of as more amateur ones. And oftentimes you might see a podcast evolve over time. So if you listen to a podcast over many years, you might hear it mature in its sound and production values, in its content, in the types of people they can bring on to interview, that sort of thing. But you can also see podcasts that are just for fun that people are doing in their garages and in their basements. And so it's really the broadest spectrum of things. And there's room enough for all of those things. And podcasts, have been rising in popularity for quite some time. And I think that there was a moment maybe a few years ago, 5 or 6 maybe years ago, where it looked like maybe they were going to be replaced with some other media. But they're really coming back strong. And I have to believe it's partly because of the pandemic. They were already really, really popular, and there was a proliferation of podcasts. But now I think with the pandemic, I think it's a more accessible kind of production than video production might be. I think it's a little bit easier to do it with whatever equipment you have on hand rather than needing to have really fancy equipment, TikTok videos aside. And this is not intended to be sort of a comprehensive ontology of podcasts, but we can think of different types of podcasts that are out there. For many of us in this virtual space together, we might be most interested in scholarly podcasting. That is taking our scholarship and making it publicly accessible, as Barry Lamb has done with Hi-Fi Nation, and Ed Ayers and his team has done with Backstory. Hi-Fi Nation was started at the National Humanities Center. Barry Lamb is a philosophy professor at Vassar. Backstory started out at University of Richmond and is about US history, and they bring in different historians to talk about their work. We have more story-driven kinds of podcasts, and I think Snap Judgment is a really good example of that, as well as the episodic. And I don't know how many of you ever listened to Serial, which was a kind of a spin-off of This American Life. Serial had at least 3 seasons, and the first season was it went so viral and was so addictive. I was addicted to it. It was just this wonderful example of how to thread different episodes of a single story across, I think there were maybe 12 or so episodes, I can't remember, telling this very intriguing story about a high school student in Maryland. S-Town, I think, came out of Radiolab and was sort of similar. It was a 1-season show that was really compelling and wonderfully confusing as well. There are also thematic podcasts out there. My partner loves Gastropod, which is about, it's focused on food science and the history of food. And I used to be an avid listener of 99% Invisible, a show dedicated to design. And then there's pure entertainment. I used to listen to Welcome to Night Vale a lot, which was fantasy, and then Two Dip Queens is a great example of comedy. There's also a huge number of sports podcasts, which I don't listen to because I don't understand sports ball. Okay, so what are you listening to? So I was hoping at this point folks would want to share either through chat or by unmuting yourself some of the things that you're listening to.
I listen to Pod Save America,
Mm.
and I used to listen to My Favorite Murder. I also listen to Call Your Girlfriend, which is like a feminist podcast.
Oh, very cool. And I just realized I did not share the link to the slides. I shared it with the waiting room instead of all of y'all, so sorry about that. I see some other things coming in. Armchair Experts 1619 project. I presume that's connected to the New York Times series by the same name. 10% Happier, about Buddhist meditation. My Favorite Murderer, fantastic. Folklore podcast, wonderful. So we're seeing already a really great example of podcasts for sort of listening pleasure, podcasts for enlightenment, podcasts to learn more, lots of different NPR podcasts like Invisibilia, things to help us with our pedagogy. Wonderful, fantastic. I'll save this chat and keep this running list of wonderful podcasts. The reason that I ask the kinds of things you're listening to is it can be very instructive to essentially reverse engineer what we listen to as a way to figure out what it is we want to produce. So thinking about, for those of you who do listen to podcasts even occasionally, thinking about the things you like and the things you dislike, let's think about what are some of the components that make up a good or a bad podcast. And for those of you interested in scholarly podcasting, similarly thinking about how those podcasts might be similar to or different from the kind of sort of convention, more so-called traditional approaches to scholarship, a paper, an article, a monograph, a conference paper, that sort of thing. So let's think a little bit about what is it that keeps you coming back and listening to more podcasts, or the same one over and over again, I mean, to different episodes of the same podcast. So Clarissa says compelling storytelling. Yes, for sure. The story, yeah, it has to, there has to be something that draws us in and keeps us coming, right? Authenticity, that's a lovely one, yeah. And that could be, I guess, authenticity of the podcaster. The example I gave about Gastropod, one of the things that I've noticed about that is my partner, when he talks about Gastropod, he talks about the two hosts as if he knows them, as if they're old friends. I think they managed to strike this feeling of authenticity. Some folks are saying they like to have more than one host, good audio quality, clean editing, jargon-free language, and something that's more conversational, humor. Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of similar themes coming up here. Layering of sound and music that Stephanie brings up. That's a really interesting example because a lot of this, it's kind of like art in the sense of there's not one universal way that we experience podcasts and what people like about podcasts. And so some folks might really like the sound layering, and others might think it gets to be too much. And a really good example of that is Radiolab. I really love Radiolab. I don't know how many of you listen to Radiolab, but Radiolab does a lot of interesting experiments with sound and the layering of sound, the way that they use sound effects, the way that they overlap voices. I really love it, and not to pick on my partner, but he hated it for years. And so something that really kept me coming back to listening to Radiolab repelled him. So we can think of the things that draw us in, but we're never going to find sort of a universal, like, do these 10 things and everyone will love your podcast, right? Like, it's a combination of the story, how people relate to it, the sound, whether it speaks to them, whether they feel a connection to the podcast. And so, so just sort of a caution of like, there's not like one magic formula here. For scholarly podcasts, those who have auxiliary websites that contain transcripts, show notes, bibliographies, additional resources, so sort of get you started and then let you do that deep dive down that rabbit hole, fantastic. We can think about some of the components of podcasting as sort of falling under these broad headings. So obviously there are voices. You know, you have your hosts, you have typically interviewees, or you might have actors who are reenacting something. I think it's not very typical, although I haven't listened to the widest range of podcasts out there. I think it's rare to just hear one voice. And I think based on the comments that people are sharing in chat, that's for good reason, right? We want to hear a variety of voices. It's hard to just listen to one voice for an extended period of time. And so that sort of mixture of voices is really important. The content really does matter, right? So if it's a scholarly podcast, what kind of sources are you using? Are you pulling in audio clips, good interviews, that sort of thing? That narrative arc, whether you're making a scholarly argument or you're engaging in storytelling, and I would argue those two things are actually not dissimilar, and we shouldn't really maybe split those apart. But you want to have some sort of shape to your podcast, to that singular episode, or if you're doing an episodic podcast, to how the individual pieces fit together, and then how are you going to help someone who maybe missed an episode. So oftentimes you see like a 3-part podcast. Do I have to listen to them in order, or can I just go back and forth? How do you help someone through that overarching narrative story? And then, and this has come up a lot in the chat, that sound, right? So the background music that sets a mood, makes you feel something, the sound effects that punctuate and help you illustrate and sort of visualize, paint that audio landscape for folks. Any questions about that before I continue? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to keep going. So I want to, speaking of Radiolab and speaking of sound audio landscape, I really want to encourage us to think about podcasts as a soundscape, right? We're visualizing with sound. And I'm going to play this brief clip from, it was actually a promo for Radiolab from about a year ago that I just serendipitously happened to listen to right before doing a podcast workshop. And hopefully you'll hear my sound, where one of the producers of Radiolab talks about the process. Oops. It would help if I hit play.
Hey, I'm Simon Adler. I'm a producer here at the show. And I remember when I started working at the show a couple years back, I really had the feeling like my parents didn't quite understand what I did for a living. Like, they got that I interviewed people and told stories, but beyond that, I think they just thought I spent my time Googling things. And so what I started doing when I'd go home and visit them was I'd bring a laptop, open up a Pro Tools session, the program we use to make the show, and then I would walk them through some of the decisions, the moves, really the work that went into making one of these scenes. And so, oftentimes I'd start by playing back the music that we'd composed and written for that scene. Then I'd bring in some tape from an interview.
I'm generalizing it way too much.
Like one we did with Bharat Bhuva here about what happens when a cosmic ray collides with the Earth.
So when one of the particles comes into the atmosphere, then it's...
And then from there, I'd start to play for them all the sounds that we'd combined and contorted to bring the scene to life. Like this airplane flying overhead, thunderclaps, fireworks exploding. And then I'd put it all back together and play the whole thing for them, so they'd hear something like this.
When one of the particles comes into the atmosphere, it starts interacting with all the air particles.
And then I'd explain that, well, I was doing all this for this one tiny little scene.
Working.
Producer Annie McCune was working on a different set of scenes.
Working.
And I'd describe to them how our unrelenting editor, Soren Wheeler,
Chapter 1 thoughts messier, less production is good.
would have us build.
I don't know, somehow it's a little too pointed.
And rebuild.
I think you should ignore me.
And rebuild these little moments until... Finally.
Oh, wait, you're listening?
Okay.
We'd decide that it was done, the episode would go out, and end up in my parents' and your ears.
You're
Listening
to Radiolab.
Now, I start with this because...
Okay, so I think hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of layering that's possible. Here we have someone narrating, pulling in an interview clip, sound effects, as well as background music, and then the layering of different voices. And that's sort of very typical for Radiolab, and not all podcasts sound like that. And again, not all people like the sound of that. So it's a matter of figuring out that personal preference and thinking about how that sound fits in with our overall goal of the podcast. Are you trying to evoke a certain feeling? Are you trying to engender a certain response? You know, we really want to make sure that the sound effects that we use and sound effects, you know, writ large, match the thing we're trying to do and talk about in our podcast. It would be really jarring to have a really serious podcast about, you know, say, you know, the recent protests for racial justice this summer, or the ongoing protests, and have music that was inappropriate to that, either inappropriately upbeat or cheerful or sunny or something like that, or lyrics that contrasted with the larger message of that podcast. So it all really fits together, and it's something that you know we need to think about. And again, it's sort of as much magic as it is science, in that there's not like one perfect formula there. But thinking about it and being intentional about it helps. So a couple things to think about when you are ready to begin your own podcast is, first of all, that balance of the voices, the words, the sound effects. How do you want to balance that, and how does that advance the goals of your podcast? Whether you're trying to share your scholarship or you're trying to entertain folks or anything in between, how does that balance fit in? Also making sure that you're using things that you are allowed to use, and we'll spend a little bit more time in just a bit talking about copyright and how to find free stuff. And then accessibility, and I saw some of you in the chat, we're already starting to talk about this a little bit. Transcript is one big way that we can make podcasts accessible, but it's not the only way. And through all of this, again, and this is something we're going to come back to, particularly in the last workshop in November, is thinking about our audiences. For those of us who are digital humanists or interested in digital humanities, we try to be very user-centered, right? So we always think about our audience. If you're writing a book, same thing. You're writing to a particular audience, whether it's scholars in your field or you want to write a crossover book that is interesting to a broader group of folks. And you want to think about, again, that intended audience, but also people who might stumble onto your podcast, right? Like the goal would be, I put a podcast out there and it goes viral. And suddenly all these people who I hadn't imagined would be interested in anything I had to say are suddenly listening. And so if that's the case, especially if we're engaging in scholarly podcasting, thinking about the place of jargon, and I do think someone mentioned that in the chat. Do we have to use jargon? When do we have to, and when can we avoid it? How do we make our story accessible to whoever our intended and unintended audiences are? And so these are things that we want to think about as we begin planning a podcast and keep in mind throughout the entire process. This slide, and you can just grab it at your leisure. And again, I'll put that link back into chat in just a few moments. This has a lot of different reading and resources for best practices for creating podcasts. So you can do a deep dive in some of the popular literature about this, including what Apple recommends and what different colleges are recommending for those who are doing that. So that's just a little smattering of resources there. Okay. So I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the project lifecycle. And this is something that, for those of us who engage in digital projects, we might think about this a little bit more regularly than for those of us who don't. But I would encourage you to think about anything you're doing as having a life cycle. Any kind of scholarship, for instance, that you're working on, you do some sort of pre-planning phase where you have a question or an idea for something. You maybe do a little digging to see if that's a viable thing to explore. Then we go through some sort of design phase where we, in the digital world, we might mock things up, do a very light test, see how it works, build the thing if it's something we're building from scratch, or develop a data set that we want to visualize, whatever it might be. We then put it into practice, we implement it, we create the thing, We test it. This is all done iteratively, so I'm not going to cleanly go from design to implement to test. I might go from design back to pre-plan, then to implement, test, design, test, design, test. And then when I'm ready to release the thing, I would share it, disseminate it, but I would also want to evaluate it, assess it, sustain it, preserve it, and reflect on the process. So the podcast creation life cycle is really not that different. And this workshop series is really going to follow us through several of the steps, though not in order. We're actually going to end with some of the planning stuff, where we might engage in the scripting and the storyboarding. But again, this is not a linear process necessarily. There's a phase in the life cycle where we are both recording and gathering content, whether we're gathering audio clips that we need to use, or we're doing interviews, or whatever that might look like. There's the whole production and post-production phase where we're editing, we're mixing, we're remixing. We're doing all of all of that work to not just to edit the sound, but to make it all come together. We're not going to talk in this workshop series about step 4, but for those of you who are looking to launch podcasts and get them into feeders like Apple Podcasts, there's a process of indexing metadata and validation to get it to show up in the RSS feed. And some of those resources that I shared in the last slide can talk about that. And then you would actually submit it. So again, we'll be talking about several of these throughout the course of these workshops. And again, if you can't make every workshop, it's no problem. You can access the slides, and once the videos are posted, you can access those as well. Okay, we're going to shift gears again. So before I do that, I just want to see if there are any questions from anybody before we dive into the scary world of copyright. Okay, I don't see anything, so I'm going to proceed. I'm going to start with a caveat. I am not a copyright expert, and I am not a lawyer. So I am not equipped to advise you on the nuances of the law, or to tell you, yes, you can use this, or no, you can't use that. But I can let you know about this more generally, and I would be a bad librarian if I wasn't doing that. So I think most of us are probably familiar with copyright in terms of it's, to protect the intellectual property and the commercial value of things that we create. And not everything is created that is put out there is copyrighted, but we do need to be mindful of that. And even if we're creating podcasts as part of a classroom exercise or an assignment or as a scholarly thing, we need to be mindful of that even under the clause of fair use, which is an exception to copyright law, largely for educational purposes, that allows the use of portions of copyrighted material as long as they meet these four components, four elements, so that we're not profiting off of the reuse of something that, and it is for educational purposes, that we're not really stealing the creative aspects of that, that we're not taking the heart of the work, or that if we are, we're transforming it, and that we're not affecting the potential future market harm of this. Now, one thing I will say is if there's anyone out here who's a musicologist or interested in podcasting about music, I am not equipped to advise on how much you can sample from, say, an album to review it in a podcast. But if you are interested in that, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to help you find someone who, whether you're at SDSU or at your own institution, who might be able to advise on that. So I just don't want to promise that something that I can't deliver. So generally speaking, there are ways that we can determine whether we can use something, and there's lots of different copyright checklists and decision trees that are online. These typically apply to content that is text-based or maybe visual-based, so not as much to do with sound-based. But we can search for things that have been put into with Creative Commons, unless they've specified no derivatives can be used, doing a Creative Commons search. Again, the audio may or may not come up with that. And we can do other kinds of searches for public domain content. If you use Google, and I don't anymore, under advanced search, you can typically constrain your search for things that are free to use or reuse. But there are a range of really awesome websites out there that allow you to get free music or sound effects. Lately, I've been using the Free Music Archive quite a bit. It's really great. You can look for sort of genre of music and you can explore lots of different options and just download that and port it into your audio editing software. Thematic is a good one too. It's kind of more designed to connect musicians with people who are trying to like launch YouTube videos and other things like that, or podcasts. But it's there. I used to use OpSound a lot, and lately the site has been down, so I'm not sure. I left it in here just in case it ever goes back up. This second link here, list of public domain sites, lists a bunch of different places where you can get free music. Some are based on subscription. So you might have to pay a monthly fee to get access to music if you wanted to do that. For sound effects, I typically go to free sound. You have to set up an account, but it's free. And then it's somewhat still beta and limited, but the Library of Congress, I think this summer launched Citizen DJ, which is a remixing of free sounds that you can try to grab. There's some stuff on the Internet Archive through its collection of podcasts and audio, but it may or may not be free to reuse. And then YouTube also has a free music audio library. So if you click that link, you can actually find audio that you can actually download. If you are a musician or you have friends who are musicians, you can always ask or commission them if you have the funds to produce content for you and then promote their work. So there's lots of different options for us, even if we don't have the capacity to create our own music. In our Podcasting Summer Institute that we ran with the National Humanities Center back in June, we had a couple musicians in the Institute and they actually created their own music, which was awesome. But for the rest of us, we used Free Music Archive. And I would encourage you to think about how you can give credit. So giving credit to the content you use, especially for any music or sound effects. And just as a quick example, all of the audio that's in the folder for this workshop series, I just created a Google Doc listing as much information as I knew about what I'd gotten. So you can see that here's all the free music I got, and then here's all the sound effects I got. The only thing I didn't do was credit my own audio files of me speaking that I just use for training purposes, which I didn't feel needed to be credited. So thinking about how we can give credit, one really common way is through voiceover end credits. So having some outro music and just saying, you know, this podcast was made possible by so-and-so and the music is by so-and-so and that sort of thing. If you're going to be loading your podcast into SoundCloud or a podcast feeder, such as the Future Faculties Lab at SDSU, which is right here, you can actually do it in your descriptions. So if you look at this, so these are podcasts that faculty here at SDSU are creating. You'll see that they list the names of the interviewers, but you could just as easily list where you get, you know, who created the music or where you got the music for your podcast in the episode description. I would also encourage folks to think about not just providing giving credit to those who helped with the production, but also contextualizing the podcast. So this podcast, you know, was this podcast created as part of a class at SDSU? You could say, you know, this podcast was created for English 562 in fall 2020 with Professor Jessica Pressman, or this was part of the National Humanities Center Summer Institute held at the Digital Humanities Center. And I would also encourage, for those of you who are engaging in podcasting right now, I would really encourage you to reference the date and maybe even the pandemic. And the reason why is that we're producing content right now that's part of a moment. And if you're limited in the equipment you can use, or you don't have a really great place to record, and we'll talk about that next time, it's a way to contextualize the sound, right? Like I feel like this is really a DIY moment, right? We're doing what we can with what we have in lockdown, for those of you who are in states who are largely still staying at home. And so it's really part of a moment, and we might as well illuminate that moment and let people know that that's what we were doing. Any questions about any of that before I go on? Okay, it doesn't look like any questions are popping up. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about accessibility, and we've hinted at some of this stuff already. And it's easy enough to think about the primary kind of hurdle to sort of a universal design approach to podcasts, which is to say that there are folks who might have hearing impairments that would limit their ability to listen to a podcast. And we've already talked about creating transcripts to support that. But there's a whole range of other types of things that we might want to think about. For podcasts that have a visual component, we do need to think about that. And the audio plus the transcript can kind of balance out the visual problems. We can also think about while let's say our podcast is primarily intended for English language speakers, how would folks whose first language is not English listen to our podcast, and is that an issue? Is that a problem? And is there something we can do? Whether we, I'm not saying we record our podcast in multiple languages, and typically if you are interviewing someone for an English language podcast who's not speaking English, you might do a voiceover translation, but maybe we could offer multiple types of transcripts if we have the capacity to do so. Another thing to think about, and this sort of runs a little counter to the definition I offered of podcasts, is, because podcasts are something that we typically are streaming from the internet. There are people who can't fully stream online content. They might live in areas that don't have good broadband infrastructure. They might not have the kind of Wi-Fi service in their home that supports streaming of a lot of content, or they might be using limited data plans to stream content. And so this is a hard thing to think through, and it's something that I encountered several years ago when I was working on a digital project at UNC Chapel Hill. It was a project to digitize and return to a community oral histories and interviews done by a researcher in the late 90s, early 2000s. The community was close to Colón, Panama, in a small town called Portobello. Even though we had a vague idea of how they accessed internet, when we tried to take the project, and not we, I didn't actually get to go, but when the researcher, the PI, went and brought the project into Portobello, she realized, one, there were huge swaths of time back then that there were blackouts. A lot of people didn't have, there was no real broadband infrastructure, and folks were using older generation phones to access internet content. And so streaming content was just not going to be possible for this project that we had developed. So we began to think about offline ways of sharing content. So for instance, sharing files in a different way. So if you're trying to reach folks and you're concerned about that, you will have those files. Are there other ways you can share them? Some of this is sort of an infrastructural problem that we in this room can't necessarily solve, just something to think about and to think as accessibly as we can about what we create. Any questions about that before we continue? See one thing in chat. Oh yeah, 8-track tapes, and hope that people have 8-track players. Okay, if there are no other questions, okay, let's proceed because I want to be mindful of everybody's time. A couple of nitty-gritty things, and we will cover more of this in the future, in the more technical workshops of recording and particularly in editing. But I just want to cover this a little bit, just so you're aware of this. There are a whole range of audio file formats out there beyond what we might be familiar with MP3 and WAV. I was kind of surprised to learn how many there are. And different streaming platforms accept different formats. This is a lot. The thing to keep in mind is sort of the safest thing for streaming is going to be MP3. That's kind of like the PDF of audio files in terms of I haven't met a system that couldn't like play an MP3. MP3s are small. They're what's called compressed, typically lossy compressed, which means that you've removed a little bit of the data that, or the sort of layers that are part of the file, but it doesn't really, it's negligible, and other than, most listeners won't detect the difference unless you're like an audiophile. And WAV files are much bigger, and they're typically used for editing and for preservation. We might think of them maybe as a TIFF file equivalent for images. TIFFs are really large, high quality image files, but you can't put one up online. It's just too big, it takes up too much server space. So in our case, we're going to be dealing with sort of three types of audio files. Project files while we're editing. So .aup is the project format in Audacity, and we'll see that in a couple of weeks or a month from now. And that's where we do the actual work, and then the sort of WAV file in the MP3. And the only thing to really keep in mind right now, typically when you're ready to mix down and export a file from the project to either a WAV or MP3, your system is going to ask you for the type of compression. I typically like to have multiple versions of my files because I'm kind of uptight like that. And so I might have a lossless compressed version, assuming I have enough space wherever I'm storing stuff. And then I might also compress. And that's going to be the last step, because once you've compressed, then unless you go back to that original project file, you won't be able to uncompress. But that's the file that you're going to share. So whether you're submitting it for a class assignment or you're submitting it to Apple Podcasts or SoundCloud, it's going to be pretty much that lossy file, because that's going to be small enough to actually send digitally. Okay. So a couple other things, and then I'm going to stop screen sharing, share some links with you, and then we can open up and see if there's any specific questions. There are just a whole bunch of resources out there available for you. I include this slide, even though right now, most of the campus resources are not available. There are computer labs on campus and in the library, some of which have Audacity and other kinds of audio editing software on them, but we can't access them right now. Some of the desktops that we can remote into might have Audacity, but I'm not sure if they've been updated. In normal times, non-pandemic times, there is equipment, microphones and that sort of thing that can be checked out at the library circulation desk if you're at SDSU, and our podcasting studios in the DH Center, again, if you're at SDSU and it's not a pandemic. The main point of today and the workshop this whole semester is make use of what you have. You don't need to go out and buy fancy microphones or anything like that. You can make a podcast without that stuff. If you want to invest in some of those things, that's great, but you don't feel like you have to. And you don't have to buy fancy software either, and we'll be covering this in the coming sessions as well. There's lots of free stuff out there, and I typically try to show the free stuff. We're going to be focusing first on Audacity, which is free. And what I like about Audacity is it works on Macs, PCs, or Windows machines and Linux. For those of you at SDSU, everyone now has access to the Adobe Creative Cloud through your SDSU ID, and so we'll also be showing you Audition. But there's lots of other stuff out there too. And I'll cover some of this in future workshops as well. Okay, so with that, that's it for the formal part of this session. I just want to remind you of where we're going. So on October 2nd, we're going to actually talk about how to record by yourself and what kind of conditions you need, and how to record with others, especially when you're not in the room together during this pandemic. And then we'll show you different ways, different tools you can use for editing your audio files. And again, that last session is going to sort of tie it all together with ways of staying on track, organizing your files, planning your podcast. We'll do a little bit of talking about project management as well as storyboarding and things like that. So what I'm going to do right now is stop sharing. I'm going to put some links into chat, including a really quick survey for workshop feedback, and then open it up and see if folks have questions or things they want to talk about in the last roughly 7 minutes of the session. Just feel free to unmute yourself or throw something in chat.
Hi, Pam. Thanks so much for this really great workshop series. It's really helpful. I had a quick question just about podcast trailers. So I'm in the sort of post-production process of completing a podcast for my department. And instead of doing some, or how do I say this? In the introduction of every episode, I'll do a sort of like couple sentence overview of like what the podcast is. But I don't know if you have any experience or any suggestions about podcast trailers, which are maybe just like 30-second episodes to include, or not episodes, but a 30-second trailer to include in sort of your podcasts feed. I don't know. I don't know if I'm being quite clear.
And is it, you're wanting to sort of highlight all of the episodes, not a specific one?
Yeah, so it's really just to give sort of an overview of what the podcast is, since it's a part of the department, and I imagine that some people, it'll be explicit, but I kind of wanted it to be sort of like a teaser trailer or something I could upload to our Twitter or what have you, like something to share that's bite-sized that people can just sort of hook them into listening to the other episodes.
Yeah, you know, thinking about some of the sort of trailers I've heard, you know, if you have a really compelling sound clip, like really, really short, that is kind of like a hook or kind of leaves people wanting to hear more, you could do that and be like, what were they talking about? Find out by listening to so and such and such. You know, you could do something like that. The way that I typically feel my way around with this sort of thing is actually listening to other examples. And so NPR, often you'll hear that. And if you listen, I mean, I keep coming back to NPR because it's mostly the kind of podcasts I listen to right now or spun out of NPR studios. But oftentimes they'll promo another podcast while I'm listening to one podcast. And so, you know, you might have or want to develop a sort of clever tagline for the podcast or use a sound clip or something that sort of is that cliffhanger kind of thing. And that could be a way of doing that. And you might need to think about multiple of these, not just one, but, you know, a couple little sound bites that you can pepper in other places.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure, yeah. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, hi Pam.
Hi, I can't see who's, oh, there you are. Hey, David.
It's David. Fantastic. This is great, and just what at least I and I think my students, a lot of other people needed. So thank you so much for doing this. Super excited about it. It has me thinking of a lot of things, and I have to admit that I'm super late to the whole podcast thing, and I ask my students all the time why they listen to podcasts and when they listen to podcasts. And I'm trying to think about these things that interest me intellectually like that, combined with now that I'm going to, and my students and I are trying to create one or them, how to keep people listening is one question. But I'm also just really interested in the fact that it seems to be working, and I don't really understand why. And I'm sort of curious if there's research yet that shows it. I mean, I saw someone in the chat say they listen while they're doing dishes. And that's like the #1 answer I get from my students too.
Yeah.
Is that effective learning, I guess? Like, I don't want to stop people from listening, but is that effective learning? And it totally freaks me out given, I put this in the chat, but like what I learned at our teaching institute this summer is that sort of students' attention spans for video top out at 3 to 6 minutes, which shocked me as someone who teaches with a lot of media. So what's the difference with this, and why is it working? And how can we make it work better, I guess, even?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know of any scholarly research on this yet, but I haven't been looking. But I do know that like the person who runs the podcasts at our local NPR station, KPBS, knows a lot about listening patterns that she's been able to sort of mine from what she sees in terms of clicks and things like that. In terms of like what makes it effective or how do we keep people listening, these are really interesting questions. And I think one of the things about podcasting is that you don't need to sit and watch it, right? You can, typically people are doing other things. For me, it's walking the dog, cleaning the house, cooking. Well, I don't cook, but baking. And back in the day, commuting. So I've noticed I don't listen to nearly as many podcasts now because I'm not leaving the house as much. So my podcast consumption has gone way down in the pandemic. For others, it might have gone way up. Maybe people are tired of binging Netflix, or maybe they've watched everything that's possible on Netflix. I don't know. But I don't know. And I think it also matters what kind of podcast it is and why someone's listening, right? So I would have a hard time listening to like a scholarly podcast while doing something else and retaining that information. But if I'm listening to something that's more journalistic, I feel like I can do that and listen to something else or doing something else. So it's a really interesting question about listening behavior and how do we use podcasts effectively if we're using them in scholarly ways. And some interesting comments coming up in chat in response to your question, David. You know, some folks think you can absorb more when you're doing something else rather than just sitting attentively and trying to listen. I'm one of those people who might listen to a podcast in chunks. I can do maybe a 20-minute spurt. It's really hard for me to listen to more than about 20 minutes unless I'm in the car driving a really long distance. And so that's not something we've talked about, but sort of what's the optimal amount of time for a podcast? And I'm not entirely sure I have the answer to that because I've seen some that are really short. I've seen some that are longer. For the longer ones, I just listened to them over multiple dog walks, for instance. I don't know that I have like the secret sauce here or anything like that. I don't know that I have that answer, but these are really good questions and they're things to be asking as we're diving into and making podcasts. And I think it's a good idea to, if you're doing this, if you're assigning this in your classes or you're doing this for class, to talk explicitly about our relationship to podcasts, how we engage with them as that starting point for trying to think about how audiences are intended or unintended audiences might be doing that. And to answer your question, I mean, I think 30 minutes is about the upper length for me. I like, 20 to 25. Scholarly podcasts I find tend to be longer. And maybe that's not surprising.
Typical.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to actually stop the recording. We're at time, but I want to invite folks who want to hang out and continue the conversation to do so for a couple more minutes. Let me just stop the recording.